The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, in this, the third year of a national-led government, New Zealanders are getting rather tired of this National Party blaming the consequences of its own economic mismanagement on other events and other people. Mr Speaker, let me begin where Mr Foss began, with the people of Christchurch. I had 2 hours down there this morning, Mr Speaker, standing in the liquefaction with a stench of sewage, talking to 2 or 3 dozen people who for 15 days haven't had power, water, sewerage, or even access to decent toilets. One gentleman I talked to said his next door neighbour is 84 years old. He's an ex-RAF pilot. He has a heart condition and he's on drugs. And Mr Speaker, each morning and sometimes in the middle of the night, he has to walk 300 metres up the road before he can find a portaloo. And that really isn't good enough for the people of the eastern suburbs. So our sympathies go to those people, but they need more than our sympathy. They actually need active intervention and active government, because 15 days after the earthquake, people should not be living in those conditions. But it's no good, Mr Foss, blaming the earthquake for New Zealand's perilous economic position. I've got in my hand, Mr Speaker, last week's Bank of New Zealand weekly overview. And what does it say? It said before we even had the earthquake, the data was showing a recessionary finish to 2010 and a recessionary start to 2011. It says, Mr Speaker, basically we were back in recession before the earthquake struck. Mr Speaker, that makes New Zealand one of just 2 countries in the developed world that is facing a double-dip recession. And I say to Mr Foss that he needs to look to his own government's actions or inactions to explain that. How do you explain that when New Zealand is getting the best prices in 38 years for its export products? The very best prices, and Mr Foss knows that because he's a farmer. He's getting a bigger wool check, a better lamb check, and he's smiling and grinning now, a tax cut, because he's got hundreds and hundreds of dollars a week in tax cuts personally. But I want to tell him about what it's doing to the rest of New Zealand. And it's no good, Mr Foss, you blaming the last Labor government, because Bill English will take the next call, and on the 18th of December in this House he stood up and he said, as a new Minister of Finance, the books of this country are in reasonable shape. The government, he said, was saving for a rainy day. It wasn't his government, he'd just become the minister, and that rainy day had come. Mr English picked up a country that had zero net government debt. No comparison to the countries of Europe that were heavily overburdened with debt. He picked up a country that had one of the lowest rates of unemployment in the world. And yet today, Mr Speaker, in the third year of this national government, 700 additional New Zealanders every week are losing their jobs. Every week are losing their jobs. And you know the shameful thing that shows that this government is so much out of touch with ordinary New Zealanders? Mr Key said that the number of people going to food banks, which has trebled, which has quadrupled, is because people are taking lifestyle choices. Let me tell you, Mr English, one of the people I spoke to this morning, his wife lost her job in the earthquake. She'll get 6 weeks' payment. But what happens after that? Their mortgage repayments aren't going to halve, but their income has. Their income has. And possibly that family, like so many other families who never in their life have gone to a food bank, will be looking for additional assistance. Not because of lifestyle choice, but because their income has halved and their cost of living has gone up. And I say this to you, Mr English. Mr English, I say this to him.
Order. I've allowed the member to get away with... Order. I'm on my feet. I've allowed the member to get away with it a couple of times, but in debate, members must not refer specifically to other members, you, Mr English, because it leads to disorder. Sorry, I apologise to the member. We mustn't do that.
I say this to Mr English, that it did not help people who are going to the petrol stations each week and paying more than $100 to fill up their petrol tanks, who go to the supermarket every week and are paying more and more money for everything they buy, that go and have to pay more for the government charges that Mr English is imposing on them. It does not help those people that this government has contributed to their increased cost of living by a GST increase, but has not delivered on what Mr Key promised, which was everyone would be overwhelmingly better off because of the tax switch. Mr Key is better off. He's better off by $1,000 a week. $1,000 a week he has given himself in tax cuts. Of course he feels everyone's better off. But how about talking to the guy down the road who's a cleaner on the minimum wage? He got 25 cents an hour. 25 cents an hour. That doesn't come close to meeting the increased cost of living. And his family is suffering. His family is being pushed into poverty because of tax cuts, where the National Party has looked after its wealthy mates and itself, but hasn't looked after middle-income people or lower-income people, and they are being squeezed, Mr Speaker. This government has failed because it has no plan. It has no plan about skill training. When the head of Business New Zealand says to me that the government has not put together a skill program, he's not a friend of the Labor Party. He's not an enemy of the government. He's a friend of the government, but he is telling the truth. There is no plan. And when we are thousands of skilled tradesmen short, Mr English, by the end of the year, and when you cannot build the houses that people desperately need in Canterbury, when you can't put the businesses back on their feet because there's a skill shortage, and when the costs go through the roof because of that skill shortage, maybe the national government will reflect on a lack of a plan to train people to get the 7% of Cantabrians who will be out of work back to work and rebuilding their city. That's a huge gap. And maybe Mr English will think about research and development when he thinks about why the clever, innovative companies are not coming through and providing the high-skill, high-wage, high-tech jobs. Because Mr English has cut research and development by 50%. So they don't have a skill program. He said it's not true. Ask Sir Paul Callaghan. Ask Sir Paul Callaghan. He'll tell Mr English what's true and what's not true. They've cut research and development. They've cut the skills program. They say we need to save more, and 2.5 years into the government, they have no plan for saving, but for the fact they closed down New Zealand superannuation, not contributing to that. The only thing, Mr English, that's keeping the books afloat at the moment is the return on things like the super fund and the SOEs. And they've stopped funding superannuation, and they want to sell off the SOEs. They don't care about what Kiwis think. 2-1, Kiwis are telling this national government they do not want to sell the assets that generations of New Zealanders have built up. That's bad for Kiwis. It's good for foreign investors. The foreign investors will laugh all the way to the bank. And Mr Williamson interjects. He worked for Air New Zealand. Yes, they said that selling Air New Zealand would be good for the country. It was run into bankruptcy, and Labor learned and never sold a single asset in the last 9 years of its government. But this government's going to sell it off. This National Party sold off New Zealand Rail to its mates, Mr Fay and Mr Richwhite, and they asset stripped it, they ran it into the ground, and they bought it cheap and they sold it for too much. But we needed that back for an infrastructure program. This National Party has learnt nothing. They listen to nobody. They don't listen to New Zealanders about not selling assets when New Zealanders tell them they don't want those assets sold. They don't listen to New Zealanders, the hundreds that are writing to me every week on the Marine and Coastal Areas Bill, saying they don't want this. This is not what National promised, they told me. People who have been card-carrying members of the National Party, absolutely betrayed by a government that's broken its word and is acting just to retain itself in power with the help of the Maori Party. New Zealanders are fed up with that sort of arrogance. Mr Speaker, this government has failed, and on the 26th of November this government will go.